Welcome to Flourish-Meant, the podcast on living life as you were meant to, so you can flourish. Welcome, everyone. Today I have with me Deb DeArmond. She is a recognized leader in the fields of performance development and facilitation. She's a certified writing coach as well as a life and business coach. She is also an award-winning author of 5 books. She's here to talk to us today about making the rest of your life the best of your life. Welcome, Deb. I'm so glad you're here today on Flourish-Meant.
Thanks, Tina. I'm thrilled to be with you today.
So we started chatting before the podcast, and we were talking about how important it is not to see this just like some kind of diagnosis as an end stage that you're in once you get past that empty nest place in life. So let's talk about that a little bit, because it is a little bit scary when you hit that place in your life and you no longer can identify yourself by all of the things that you once called yourself when you were younger.
You know, Tina, it's absolutely true. I was raised like an only child. I had a brother 16 years older. So I had to learn all of the things about momming. They did not come to me naturally. I didn't have an older sister who kind of parented me along with my folks. I really felt very inadequate, and I worked hard at being a good mom. I was active in all of their activities. I led PTA. I did all kinds of things. We spent time with our children, training them up in the way they should go. And you know what? They did go, and we were all grateful for that. But it's a time when that part of your life comes to an end. And for me, it was kind of abrupt. I had 3 boys in 5 years, and they married all within 2.5 years of one another, and had been off to college and military service. But when they weren't doing those things, they were home. Our house was home. Now they were going to have a home someplace else. And it was a really hard go for me initially. I was working full time. And I think that was part of my badge of honor. I felt like I had done both of those things really, really well. But when half of it disappeared, I really began questioning, okay, so what's my purpose now? I have a great job. I love it, but it's not my purpose, Lord. What is the purpose that you have for me? And that's how it really began for me. And as I talked with other women at church, even at work, they had experienced the same thing or were dreading that coming. I didn't want to dread that. I wanted to celebrate this part of my life as much as the earlier parts, but that's really how it began.
So I experienced something similar because my boys both left home for college within 2 weeks of each other. So I went from having 2 to being completely empty. And I had always thought it would be fine because I'm busy, I'm writing, I'm doing speaking, I'm doing all this stuff. And then when they left, I was like, oh no, I feel terrible about this. I miss them so much. And it's a rough thing. It's like a ripping of a piece of your life out, isn't it?
Do you know it really is? How many times did people say to your boys, or even my boy said it to me, oh, you're so-and-so's mom, you're Cameron's mom, right? Mm-hmm. I didn't have a name anymore, but I had a role, and they recognized that. But it was strange not to have that continue. And there were some stutter steps for me. I will admit to you that there were times I just felt disconnected from who I was, because I wasn't even really sure what the path was for who I was going to become, and leverage that next stage of my life. The other trip for this whole book thought was 2 issues that occurred in a fairly short amount of time, a couple of years before I got really earnest about writing. One was my sister-in-law, who moved after a 30-year marriage, came to Texas, very highly qualified in her field. And she struggled to look for a job. And eventually she said to me, I think it's my age. She was in her late 50s. And finally, she had someone who was willing to say that to her. And here's what he said. He said, well, you seem qualified. I can't find a reason not to hire you because your resume is stellar. But the truth is, he said, you're in your late 50s. He said, you might have another 5 or 6 years to work. He said, I can hire 2 kids out of college for what I'd have to pay you, and they're going to stick around a lot longer. And she was just stunned. And so was I. And that was 15 years ago. If it was today, they probably would have met again in court. I don't know. But that was startling to me. And I had an experience with training that I was doing. I was working with railroaders on the kind that are actually out there working on the railroad. I always have to sing the song in my head. And the railroad had experienced this big gap of men ready to be leaders in the company. And I was doing leadership training. And one of the things that we were doing in one of our sessions was to help them establish how their values play into the choices they make in life. And so they had an activity where they had to decide who were the 5 out of 9 people who had been stuck on a Pacific island in the middle of the ocean. Who were they going to save when that rescue chopper that they had been formed was on the way, because they could take only 5 of the 9. And there were brief descriptions of each of the 9, Tina. But here's what I learned very quickly for doing this twice a week for 8 months. The woman who's described as 55, housewife, high school education, she's going to die every single time. They're going to leave her behind. And the quote that stuck with me most was a young man who said, "Hey guys, come on," because after they made their initial choices and they came together as a group to make the final choice. "Hey guys, she's 57 years old. She's raised her kids. She's done her job. So what's she got left to do? Just die."
Wow.
And I wanted to poke those kids really hard. But you know what? It fired up something in my belly that the Lord started working on. And he said, "Didn't like that, did you? No. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it, Deb?" And so the very first website I ever had was called My Purpose Now. And the tagline was, "We may be done, but we're not finished." Because God has so much purpose for his grown-up gals. And it's exciting to watch it happen. I don't know about you, but we've always believed that wisdom comes with age. Well, guess what? For some people, age comes alone. There's no wisdom attached to it that they're aware of. But when you begin drawing on it, oh, it's a good, sweet spot to live in.
So how do you go from a place of losing what you thought your identity was to discovering the rest of your identity is before you?
I think one of the things that I did is I really pressed into the Word. I wanted to know more about the Word. I wanted to understand what they call them the aged in some translations of the Bible, which I don't care for. One of the things that I did as I began to look at what the next act of my life might look at is I looked at those Bible characters. And Naomi and Ruth stood out for me because Naomi was a widow, as was her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who really didn't want a traveling companion, who had decided that her life was over and she just wanted to return to die in the land of her youth. But Ruth was persistent. And the story continues with ultimately Naomi becoming a coach, becoming a mentor for Ruth in this new world that she was living in. And if you track it back, Tina, the interesting thing, and I didn't know this until I began really researching aging, was that when Ruth married and produced that baby, he was in the line of Christ. Now, if Naomi had been unwilling, if Ruth had been rebellious, could it have derailed the plan? God would have found someone, I'm sure, to take that space, perhaps. I don't know. But there was such an important role for Naomi to play, and she didn't see it ultimately. And I think that's true with a lot of women. There are roles for us to play, shoes for us to fill, and people who are waiting on us to step into them. But we haven't really been open to that because we've come to the foregone conclusion that this is the final act.
We overcome the world's ageist mentality and perspectives that come at us every day and say, "You're too old for this. You're not what we want anymore. You're no longer important to us." And sometimes you're invisible, you're in the way, and you're not an asset. And instead focus on what God might say about who we are in our later years of life.
Do you know, Tina, it's an interesting question. I was born to parents as their surprise baby. My dad was 47, my mom was 40. And I always appreciated sort of the maturity that my folks had over some of the parents of some of my friends. But my parents said they didn't realize they were old until the day I got married. And they looked at each other and said, we've been so busy raising a child, dealing with a teenager, then a college girl. We didn't have time to worry about getting old. And there's such a focus on staying young now in our, I think, in our world. I think that's part of it, that creates that false identity. So what can we do about it? Well, we can kick it to the curb, because we are not limited by what society dictates. We're not limited. I'm not limited, neither are you, by what my next door neighbor thinks of me. I'm not limited if I'm willing to say to the Lord, look, I have days left in me. I want to use them for your advancement of the kingdom. What do you want from me? Do you know, I've never had him fail to answer. And he's answered in some ways I never could have anticipated. We've been Texans for 16 years. If anyone had told me these lifelong Californians would pick up and move, leaving all of our family and friends behind, I'd have laughed at you, but that's what God asked me to do. And part of that had to do with the fact that because there's the cost of living in Texas is so different than it is in California, I was able to take a very different approach to being one of the income earners in this house. And that was a really big thing. And I don't think I orchestrated that. And when God tapped me on the heart to write at 55, I can remember thinking, no, that's not right. But it was. And he sent 3 people who reminded me on a regular basis that I should be writing. And when I finally, after refuting all of those admonitions, said, okay, God, is there something here? He said, yes, there is. And Tina, in that moment, he told me what the very first book I was going to have to write. And the very first agent I spoke to signed me. And the very first publisher who looked at it signed it. If I needed a sign, that would be your, huge, big fire in the sky. And so I think we stop growing and we stop feeling, I don't know, current or important or valued, because we stop having things that God has purpose for us to do. We knew what we were supposed to do, raising kids. And when they're gone, well, what's my purpose now, Lord? Ask him. He'll tell you.
That is definitely a miracle to get your first book signed and your first agent to sign you. For those who are not writers out there, that is absolutely a miracle of God for that to happen. So when God gives you a sign that there's an open door, it's because you were listening and looking and asking for his direction first, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because I felt lost. It's like my days used to be filled with the kids' calendars on the side of the refrigerator and trying to juggle all that, and with it all completely gone, it was overwhelming, really and truly overwhelming. And I had wonderful friends. I have a great marriage. We were married for 46 years, but there was something missing, and it was that drive to accomplish something that I knew God had for me. And it took 3 people to convince me to at least ask God.
So I'm hearing you say a couple of things that anybody could do to change their mindset from being too old to being at their expiration date or any of those other things, to being someone who still has purpose and worth and value to God's kingdom and God's purposes on the earth. And one of those things I'm hearing you say is to ask God and to expect him to give you a purpose when you ask him. Is that what you're saying?
It is. And he's given us so many good examples in the word. I mean, Methuselah, who was the oldest man to live, just before he left the planet, showed up to help Noah with the whole boat building venture. I mean, there's clarity. God is no respecter of persons, and that means persons of any age who are willing to raise their hand and say, show me what I'm supposed to do. And you know, Tina, because you've felt that call in your life, the things that you're doing. When you know you're in that, I don't know, in that groove, there is not a better feeling on the planet. And it doesn't come without some challenges along the way. I had to get education and coaching and support because now I knew I was supposed to write. And though I had done it in my professional career for years writing instructional materials, this was a very different animal. So there's a demand placed on us, but that even gives us goals. I want to take this course. I want to attend this conference. I want to hire a coach. Those are goals to be identified and then checked off. Now, it may be that you already possess the skills, you've honed them. If you led the PTA, trust me, you were a leader because you had to keep a whole lot of people who were very different happy. We've learned things along the way, and here we have this beautiful open field in front of us to take what we've learned and use it for the kingdom in a different way. I love that. Or maybe in an entirely different way. I mean, in this book, I have stories of women who had jobs all of their child rearing years, but they were bored with them. They served their purpose. They might have been flexible, or they provided the amount of income needed to support the family well. But now when there was options, I've had people who've gone back not just to get their bachelor's, not just their master's, but one of my writers got her doctorate in divinity. That's incredible. She's in her early 80s. Now, I don't know how old she was when she started that, but she wasn't a spring chicken.
Wow. So this is about growth mindset as well, not just expecting things from God when you're getting older rather than just getting old. You need to still have a growth mindset, no matter how much older than other people you might be.
Well, it's almost like anything else we do in life. If I do my part, he always does his part. Now, he's done his part sometimes on my behalf, then I went, I don't know. But what God orders in our life, Tina, he pays for. He never walks out on a check, ever. And if you've heard from him and you have even an inkling, I've created a planner that is part of the coaching process I do I still do business coaching, I do life coaching, I do writers coaching. And so much of it is we don't have clarity about what that call is. And if we could get it down in simple terms of what, when, where, how, it comes together and God's up there smiling. But yeah, it requires a commitment. It requires maybe sometimes learning some things new and maybe letting go of some old things. My parents were wonderful. I learned a great deal from them. My mother was quiet. She was reserved. My father was on the other end of that spectrum. I had a wonderful balance there. But I watched them as they ran their business and how they had to learn in order to keep up with other things. I grew up in a learning environment. Lots of people did not. My mother and I went to the library once every week for 2 hours. And we just sat and read, and then we'd write home, and she'd ask me about what I read and what I had checked out. But it was an element of my growing up. And for a lot of women, if there were a lot of children, I was under the spotlight because I was the only one at home. I had that luxury. Ask yourself, what do I need to learn in order to do what I think God's calling me or pulling me towards?
Some other things that people need to pay attention to when they're in this shift mode, besides listening to God with expectation for the rest of their life and their purpose and being in a growth mindset. What are some other things that they really need to keep mindful of and make as a shift in their mindset and their way of thinking about their next steps in life?
My mother had this great saying. I grew up with all of her Midwestern intellect and hominess, I guess. And she used to say that the only person who really likes change is a wet baby. It's true. And so when there's a change thrust on us, like empty nest, we can tend to withdraw and not explore. I don't know what the next steps are. And so part of what I think is helpful is if we can adopt a change mindset. The truth is that the world around us changes day by day. Look at how the nation has changed just in the last 18 months. It's changed dramatically, and in the way it operates and how it works and how people think about so many things. Those are changes that I'm not certain are prompted by God. But when God begins to pull you towards something, it's so tempting to rest on what you've always known, always done, and always chosen. And he's saying, trust me, come with me. And so initiating some change. I remember when we changed the last of the boys' bedrooms into an office for me, there was some sadness, but there was so much joy in that because we were setting up my little writing den. And I could feel that anticipation. So embrace change. It's the only thing we can really count on day to day, that something today is going to change in my schedule, my thinking, my plans, whatever it might be. Because we don't manage things, he does. If we can embrace change instead of fearing it or resisting it, you will go a long, long way to exploring the possibilities. Because without that, you're going to stay home. You're going to pull in. People have gotten comfortable this past year attending church at home. And churches are experiencing that. People are happy to be at home with their coffee and in their robe and slippers. And we need to be back together because there is power in numbers. And the other thing I would say is find a group of women that you truly trust with your life, that you can be transparent and open with about how you're feeling and what your fears are and what you'd like to do or hope to do. And give them permission to speak the truth in love. I always say I'm candid but kind. And I'm grateful for the people in my life who are willing to return that favor. So deal with change. Find some folks who will lift you up when you want to stay in bed, who will encourage you, applaud you, and celebrate every little forward step that you take. And they'll also tell you when it's time to get your bun in gear and move forward.
I heard you touch on fear a little bit. I think that's a huge barrier for people at any age. And there's particular fears that get in our way as we reach older ages in life. How do we overcome that trend, that natural human slide into the rut of being afraid?
One of my favorite quotes, and I couldn't even tell you today who it's from, is feel the fear and do it anyway. Weren't you afraid when you had that first baby? I was. I was scared. I don't like needles. I don't like pain. It was scary. But I would never, ever have thought of doing anything except taking that pregnancy to full term and producing those 3 beautiful babies. But I had to overcome some fears. And part of how we overcome fear is we get educated in the facts. I know a lot of people begin to have maybe some health challenges. As they age, I've faced some of mine, but the more I knew about it and understood it, the more equipped I felt to deal with it. And I took it to the Lord. I let my faith be that muscle behind eradicating the fear. And I think that for an awful lot of people, they've never ventured out of what was comfortable for them. I'll just tell you that there's nothing about aging that's comfortable. There's just not. I'm watching my 89-year-old mother-in-law, who is a champion in our family, Tina. She's the prayer warrior. She's the first of the family members any of my boys will call in the event they need something done immediately, because they know grandma's going to go to the throne immediately. Mom might have something she's in the middle of and she'll put it off until that's done. My 89-year-old mother-in-law last year knit about 800 4-piece layettes for the local preemie unit in 2 hospitals. She's provided insight for so many people who are in ministry that know us and have met her, and they just find her this really wonderfully connected to the Lord woman. She's unique. I'm grateful for her. I lost my own mother when I was only in my early 40s. Last year was the year that my mother-in-law has been my mother as long as my own mother has been in my life. She's slowing down. Her hearing is getting a little bit more difficult. She finds herself more unsteady on her feet, but she's vowed that she's going to live all the days of her life, however many of those days the Lord has her numbered for. And I believe she will do it, absolutely, without a doubt. She didn't have an easy life. And yet her faith has always carried her. Faith and fear cannot cohabit. They just can't. It's like flipping on a switch in a dark room. When that light shows up, well, the darkness has to flee. It's the same with faith and fear.
So put faith in the place where fear is trying to take over.
Absolutely. If it can get its hooks into us, Tina, it's never happy with just a couple of little, thoughts or a couple of little fears about little things. Once he's got a foot in, and the enemy wants to go whole hog. And unfortunately, I feel like the older we get, the easier it might be not to fight. And boy, it's the time to fight with all our might, because God's not done with us.
So keep fighting. Any other final tips as we're coming to the end of the podcast?
No, I think the major ones that we've talked about really are what the Lord showed me. But I do want to encourage those who are listening to be brave enough to ask him, what's my purpose now, Lord? I'm still here, so that means you still have something for me. What is it? And then sit quietly and listen. It may be a word, it may be a sentence, he may download 2 pages, I don't know. But he's certainly done all 3 of those in my life at various times. And there's an opportunity to say, well, if I'm not really certain, I'm going to plan some things I believe would be pleasing to God. And if that's not the course, Lord, stop me. If it is the course, bless me. He will. He'll answer that prayer according to his will and his word. And then just to stay in the word, Tina, because the word is our shield, it's our sword, it's the lifeblood. It protects the lifeblood of who we are. Just because we're older doesn't mean that the enemy doesn't want to deprive us of good things. I'm not willing to give in to that. I don't think you are either.
No, we definitely don't want him to steal our purpose. And he certainly is bent on doing just that. Thank you for coming and sharing all this wonderful stuff so that we can be all that God wants us to be, not just part of it, not just a few pieces of it, not just 3/4 of it, but all the way lived fully until the Lord takes us into the kingdom of God at the very, very last breath that we breathe. So what is it that people can do to follow you? Where can they find you to connect with your book and your coaching services and all the wonderful things that you have to offer?
Well, first they can find the book on Amazon. That's the place where that's all happening. We may be done, but we're not finished. And the subtitle is Making the Rest of Your Life the Best of Your Life, because I believe that's possible. They can reach me on Facebook at facebook.com/author Deb DeArmond, and it's DeArmond. They can find me on Pinterest under Deb_DeArmond, and they can find me on Twitter. My handle is just simply Deb DeArmond.
This has been tremendously insightful and encouraging and helping us to develop a new mindset where we're not ageist just because the world happens to be ageist, but we believe what God believes, that purpose is for everyone that still has life in their bones. And I hope that all of you enjoyed meeting and getting to know a little bit more about Deb DeArmond and her wonderful new book. And I hope that you will also come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.